stared from across the room, unable to process the horror unfolding before her eyes. Just days ago, the woman at the center of it all had walked into the clubhouse, unaware she'd signed her own death sentence. Now she was tied to a chair, naked, surrounded by men who took turns punching, kicking, and searing her flesh with a hot spoon. Arms, breasts, no part was spared. Naomi's mind raced. What could she have possibly done to deserve this? Later, her boyfriend, a club member, revealed the shocking truth. She was suspected of stealing a patch. A patch? Naomi's was dumbfounded. How could something so small trigger such barbarity? Without a second thought, Naomi fled the clubhouse. She wasn't just walking away. She was running, escaping a nightmare that could easily become her own. But distance offered a little comfort. Naomi knew better. The quiet was only temporary. When Jim Nolan, the president of the South Florida Outlaws, got word that a woman had seen too much, a woman who could threaten to expose their dark secrets, he gave the order. Her own boyfriend was given the task to hunt her down. And without flinching, he chose the club over the woman he once claimed to love. When she was finally dragged back to the clubhouse, Naomi knew her fate was sealed. The tables had turned, and she was next. "I didn't steal any patch," she told herself. "I shouldn't be punished like that. And my boyfriend, surely he would protect me." But Naomi was about to learn just how far Jim Nolan and the South Florida Outlaws would go. This wasn't just about power among bikers. No, their reign of terror was aimed at the most vulnerable. Women like Naomi were nothing more than prey in their world. The Outlaws MC were neck-deep in human trafficking, prostitution, and the sadistic torture of women, cruelly referred to as old ladies. This is not the kind of documentary you've seen before. In this video, we expose the unspeakable acts carried out by the Outlaws MC, like crucifying an 18-year-old over a mere $10, or selling women like they were cattle. This is a story of unspeakable violence in the biker underworld. But here's the crazy twist. The man responsible for orchestrating these horrific crimes is now a minister, preaching sermons and living a life not fully touched by the justice he truly deserves.
Say prayer. I have no shame in the gospel of Jesus Christ, and I have no shame in being a member of the Outlaw Motorcycle Club. No shame whatsoever. No, that's just, no shame. I'm proud of both. And and that's what a lot of people tell me, how I just shake their head. It's got nothing to do, it's oranges and apples. I pray for my brothers all the time.
Jim's life story will make you question everything you thought you knew about justice. It'll make you wonder, how does karma really work? Ted Bundy, John Gacy, Jeffrey Dahmer, these are all serial killers, and if you go deep down into their stories, you will see that the urge to torture people didn't just start from adulthood. It started right from the beginning. So to understand Jim, we have to go right to the start of the story. The birth of the crazy idea. Jim Nolan's story begins in the heart of New Jersey, where young Jim grew up surrounded by both the chaos and warmth of a very large family.
Yeah, I'm from New Jersey, Monmouth County, West Long Branch. I was raised down there. I stayed there until I was 12 years old. I was raised on a 21-acre chicken farm.
Life on a huge 21-acre chicken farm might seem ordinary, but for young Jim, it was anything but.
I had 5 brothers, and that was a crazy thing. 5 brothers and 2 sisters, but my youngest brother was 17 years my senior. So I had quite an upbringing. I had, 6 fathers and 3 mothers.
Surrounded by a family that felt as big as the land itself, Jim's childhood was shaped by more than just farm life. You see, in the 1940s, America was in the thick of World War II, as they were fighting on 2 fronts, against the Japanese in the Pacific and the Nazis in Europe. And no doubt this global conflict affected every corner of Jim's life. All 5 of his brothers were serving overseas during this time, leaving young Jim to grow up in their long shadows. watching the world tear itself apart.
It was an unusual time because I had all 5 of my brothers served in World War II, 2 in the Navy, 3 in the Army, and that's when I was born. And it was quite unusual.
But Jim's own life was about to unravel.
So when I was, my dad got sick, and when I was 12 years old, we moved to Fort Lauderdale, Florida.
His father's health began to decline, and soon he was diagnosed with cancer. In search of better resources, the family moved to Fort Lauderdale, Florida, and suddenly, everything familiar slipped away.
My father, he was ill, and he died of cancer. They gave him 6 months to live. He died 18 months later.
At just 12 years old, Jim was uprooted from the only home he had ever known. Suddenly, he was alone in a strange state, cut off from the last threads of his old world.
That was interesting, 1955. And the following year, because they had taken me away from all my brothers and sisters because they all went out and had families and everything else.
His new world in Florida felt empty until he found something to fill up the void: motorcycles. You see, when Jim got to Florida, he quickly fell in love with motorcycles, and he was pretty determined to get one for himself. So he convinced his parents that they should get one for him, as it would be essential for his job as a newspaper delivery man, even though that was not true.
Father ended up buying me a motorcycle so I could deliver papers and get a job, And I picked a full-dress Harley-Davidson motorcycle, and I completely convinced them, see the saddlebags on the back, you can turn around and deliver papers real easy. A total impossibility.
For Jim, the Harley wasn't just a bike. It was his ticket to freedom, a surge of power beneath him that changed everything. It became the spark of something far greater than he ever imagined. What he couldn't see then was that this first ride would ignite a lifelong pursuit of the open road, setting his destiny in motion.
My introduction into motorcycles. Well, first day I was riding around with a spark retarder all day because it sounded better. I didn't know any better. Turned it back in and let the guy away from me.
At just 13, it was more than a ride. It was his initiation into a lifestyle that would define him for years to come.
It was the introduction of my what was to be my lifestyle, because obviously, that was when I was 13. I wouldn't be 14 to the following July.
And Florida's relaxed motorcycle laws gave him the perfect opening. Towering at 6 feet 6 inches and weighing 165 pounds, he already had the commanding presence of someone far beyond his years. So, no one dared to question whether he belonged on that bike. It was as if the road was his by default.
At that time, you could ride any kind of motorcycle or motor scooter or anything in Florida with a restricted license, and you got them at 14.
Okay.
I would, but at that time I was a little bit larger than most kids, at 6'6" and about 165 pounds. Kind of slim.
Yeah, that's not your average 14-year-old, that's for sure.
They didn't bother me. The police figured, well, he's old enough to ride, so I never got problems for them a few months before I turned 14.
By the time he was 17, getting educated the traditional way didn't hold much appeal. Like the Harley he was driving, he wanted something fast and on his own will, so he quit and took the GED exams. He passed in no time, earning his high school diploma well before his peers.
Went down to Florida State Unemployment Office and was sitting down there asking the guy. They said, how old are you? I said, well, I'm 18. They said, do you have a high school diploma? I said, no, and they sent me across the street some paper to the Fort Lauderdale High School. I went in there and took the GED that afternoon and went back the next morning to take the morning when I missed. So I got my high school diploma in the mail about 3 weeks later at my mom's house. And I was not quite 16 yet.
Okay.
It was quite interesting. I thought that was very, very unusual.
At just 16, he had his diploma in hand while the rest of his class still had 2 more years to go. With so much free time in his hand, he decided to join the South Winds Motorcycle Club.
Been into bikes. And I belonged to the South Winds Motorcycle Club for a while there. And my first motorcycle club, which was very interested in my,
The South Winds MC wasn't just any club. It was a place where like-minded individuals came together, driven by their shared love for motorcycles. It was here that young Jim began to experience what it truly meant to be part of a motorcycle brotherhood. Before long, he found himself fully immersed in the vibrant motorcycle culture, surrounded by men who mirrored his passion, both good and bad.
17, something like that. maybe I could have been 18, but that's about it. But we had the only motorcycle drill team in the Moose Lodge period, universally, and so we followed a bunch of them, screwballs down in Miami and Flag Nights, and but we're much into it.
Then at the beginning of the chain events that will go on to lead him to the life that he would later come to regret. One of the guys he rode with, named Donald Tanner, left the club to join a bigger club out west. And when he came back, he brought along with him a very audacious and crazy idea. One that's so crazy and incredibly intimidating, especially for a very young Jim. But what did Jim do? He said, "Game on." Death on the cross. Donald returned with a bold vision, starting a new club. It was the late 1960s, and the Outlaws were hungry for expansion. So instead of creating something new from scratch, they decided to merge with smaller clubs, ultimately becoming the Florida chapter of the Outlaws.
Guys that we kind of hung around with, he went out west with somebody from California that came in. He went out and got in a club, and then he come back here in the early 60s.
The early 50s?
60s.
Early 60s.
Early 60s, right. And decided to start a motorcycle club.
All right.
Because we wanted to belong to that motorcycle club. So we just put a patch together, and it's called the South Florida Outlaws Motorcycle Club. The news media.
By the end of 1967, they were no longer just a small Florida outfit. They had become part of something much bigger, the Outlaws.
We changed the patch around a little bit and put the Outlaws on the top of South Florida, had other chapters. And then in 1967, we merged with Chicago and became the Outlaws of Florida.
Jim's rise within the newly formed club was swift and inevitable. His intelligence and charisma made him a natural leader. In fact, if there was ever an award for the most charismatic outlaw biker, it would surely go to Jim. Serving first as vice president, Jim wasted no time making his mark. Under his leadership, the Outlaws quickly gained notoriety, involved in everything from prostitution and narcotics to car theft and grand larceny. But during those early years, one crime in particular set them apart and put them in the headlines. It was a crime so heinous that it shocked the entire state of Florida. On November 14, 1967, 5 club members crucified an 18-year-old woman, Christine Dees, by nailing her to a tree after she failed to pay them $10. This gruesome act ignited public outrage and led the then Florida Governor Claude R. Kirk Jr. to vow to drive the Outlaws out of the Florida. Relentless police harassment followed, forcing the South Florida chapter to relocate to Fort Lauderdale. However, despite the change in location, the Outlaws thrived, growing to an astonishing 200 members at their peak. And unsurprisingly, Jim soon became the chapter's president.
President of that club, and for the next couple of decades, I was the boss. So for the 60s and 70s, I was the boss down there. And that was it.
In the wild and unpredictable landscape of the 60s and 70s, Jim led with his best gift, charisma.
You would think back in the 60s and 70s, everything was sex, drugs, and rock and roll. I mean, you turn around, you look at the Johnny Carson show, and everybody up there is stoned every night. They're high, and they're going. I mean, it was real cool. So I mean, it wasn't like motorcycle clubs back then, but everybody was kind of wacko.
Everyone.
Under Jim's leadership, the Outlaws expanded rapidly throughout Florida, merging with smaller clubs and becoming a dominant force. Thanks to his aggressive membership drive, Florida soon boasted the largest concentration of Outlaws members in the country, despite threats from the government. This expansion was majorly funded by sex trafficking. Women, referred to as old ladies, were prostituted and controlled through intimidation. But then Jim noticed something. He observed that the income from prostitution was declining, and so he soon decided to shift the club's focus. With the disco era in full swing, the demand for drugs skyrocketed, and so the Outlaws adapted quickly. Jim's Outlaws now became major players in the drug trade, forging ties with Colombian and Cuban suppliers to bring in cocaine, methamphetamine, and heroin. Under his leadership, the Outlaws grew into a criminal empire, tightening their grip on Florida with every move. But as it began to slowly unravel, Jim's personal life began to spiral out of control.
I was getting into some serious problems. I was doing some me. And I got a lot of trouble and was charged with a lot of different things. And some of them I'd find out guilty, some of them guilty. But anyway.
What year did the troubles start?
Well, I got busted on and off all through the 70s.
This led him to do all sorts of crazy things, and among them was the life-altering event that happened in the spring of 1974, one that put him on the radar of the police and the Hells Angels for the rest of his life. You see, on a particular sunny, lovely day, Jim received word that 3 members of the Hells Angels Lowell, Massachusetts chapter were headed to Florida. It was suspected they were on a mission to source drugs. Jim didn't waste time. He organized a meeting, and within hours, the 3 Hells Angels were led by the outlaw to a deserted area with a very clear order: make sure they don't come back. A month later, one of the corpses floated to surface of the river and was spotted by a motorist. After police investigation, the other bodies were found, and they were identified to be the 3 Hells Angels members who visited the state few days earlier. All hell broke loose. Now, if there's one thing everyone knows about the Hells Angels, it's that they don't take attacks on their own lightly. But no one could guess what happened next, not even the biggest men in the Outlaws. The subtle art of torture. Fast forward 2 years later, one of the outlaw members who was involved in the killing was arrested. He named the others involved in the killings and confessed that the order had been given by their president, Jim. On hearing this, and quite in far contrast with what they believe in, the Hells Angels arranged a sit-down in Durham, North Carolina in 1977 with Jim. This was an attempt on their part to solve the matter amicably. However, Jim and the other outlaw leaders failed to show, and that meant one thing and one thing only: that war between the clubs was far from over. But just before the Hells Angels could exact revenge, Jim and several of his fellow club members were arrested.
Much time in jail trying to make bonds. I spent more money in bonds and lawyer fees than people give me credit for all.
They were indicted on 3 counts of first-degree murder. During the trials, all the outlaw members involved pointed the finger at Jim. Yet, after 3 trials over 3 years, and despite a mountain of evidence against him, Jim walked free. Walking away free, though, did not stop him or his club from the heinous crimes they continued to commit, most of which revolved around the exploitation and abuse of women. And there are pretty damning instances to prove that. A woman named Joyce Carlene was invited to a trailer home in Hollywood, Florida, with the promise of finding a job. However, she soon discovered that the trailer was the Outlaws' clubhouse, but she goes regardless, a decision that she lived to regret all the days of her life. On her first day at work, Jim hit Carlene when she refused to bring him a beer. On the second day, Jim raped her at gunpoint. He informed her that as an outlaw's old lady, she would be expected to work and hand over her earnings to the club. That didn't sound right. She didn't like that. Then Jim permitted 8 other outlaws to gang rape her. Trapped without ways of escaping, the torture continued. The next day, Carlene was forced to work as a topless dancer at a local tavern, alongside other women connected to the Outlaws. But even this horror was overshadowed by what came next. On August 22, 1974, Carlene was abducted by several outlaws who suspected her of stealing clothing marked with a property patch from one of the club's women. They took her back to the clubhouse, tied her to a chair, stripped her, and then took turns punching, kicking, and burning her with a hot spoon on her arms and breasts. Afterwards, she was dumped in a remote field. Shortly after this attack, Naomi Sinakub, the girlfriend of one of the outlaws who had witnessed the torture, fled in fear of her life. Fearing that Naomi might report him to the authorities, Jim reportedly ordered club members to track her down. Naomi's boyfriend eventually found her, and under Nolan's orders, he and another outlaw took her out on a fishing boat. She was shot twice in the head, her throat was slit, and her body was disposed of. Her remains were never found, and no one was ever charged in connection with her murder. The violence against women didn't stop there. It even extended to Jim's then-girlfriend, Tina. Tina worked as both a prostitute and a topless dancer at the Chapters Club. In July 1977, she attempted to escape Jim with the help of one of her clients, Vaughn Foreman. After hiding out for a month, seeing that their plan to run away wasn't sustainable, Tina and Foreman returned to South Florida, only to be captured by Nolan. Tina was kept under armed guard, and Jim sent Outlaws members to capture Foreman, who was taken to another club member's house to be brutally tortured. A lit cigarette was stubbed out in Foreman's eye, and the barrel of a shotgun was shoved into his mouth as he begged for his life. When Jim arrived, he demanded Foreman to pay for Tina, calling her his property. Jim agreed to sell her for $100,000. Foreman managed to pay Jim $40,000 and was eventually released, along with Tina. Foreman later gave Jim another $20,000, and in the fall of 1977, he married Tina. The couple then fled to California to escape Nolan. However, Jim's criminal activities did not stop when he was sent to Florida State Prison on narcotics charges in 1980.
Serious time of the year, everybody was kind of serious. And I got
Incarceration did not stop Jim's women trafficking business. While in prison, Jim maintained control over his operations. Through another outlaw, Ronald, Jim was introduced to Iris Geoghegan, who would eventually become his personal old lady. Ronald had intended to gift Iris to Jim upon his release, but instead gave him 49% ownership of her while he was still in prison. Jim offered $2,000 to purchase the remaining 51%, and Iris, believing she would receive better privileges as his number one old lady, chose him. She moved into Jim's Fort Lauderdale home, which was watched over by another outlaw, while Nolan was still in prison. Iris also regularly visited Jim in prison and smuggled drugs for him to sell to inmates. Little did she know that she would live to regret this very decision. When Jim was released on parole in September 1980, he split his time between Fort Lauderdale and Tucson, Arizona, where he sought to extend the outlaw's influence. To justify his presence in Arizona, Nolan convinced the parole board that he worked for country musician and outlaw member David Allan Coe.
Lined up. I was a West Coast representative of Dream Enterprise and the David Allan Coe band.
Okay.
And that was my job. It was just, it wasn't for real. But later on,
the part he left out from the parole board was that he was still living off the prostitution earnings of his old ladies and still dealing drugs. In Tucson, Jim finally brought Iris, promising her a 30-day honeymoon where she wouldn't have to work. However, it wasn't until it started that she realized that Jim's intention was far from that. Jim forced her to continue working as a prostitute and began physically abusing her. In one of those incidents, he broke one of her ribs. Iris, now realizing how wrong this path has led her, began to plot of ways to escape. When Iris visited her sick mother in Florida, Jim threatened to kill her stepfather if she didn't return. Iris tried to buy her freedom, but Jim demanded $125,000, forbidding her from using her prostitution earnings. So apparently, there was no way out. 2 months after, during a night of partying, Jim assaulted Iris when she stumbled into a parked motorcycle at a biker bar. Despite police intervention, Nolan convinced them she was simply drunk, and they allowed him to take her home. At home, Nolan brutally beat her, breaking her jaw and leaving her unconscious. Iris spent 6 days in the hospital, and when she was discharged, she discovered something even more heinous that disgusted her so much that she felt the only way out was to off herself. She alleged seeing Jim sexually assaulting a 13-year-old girl. Devastated, Iris attempted suicide by overdosing on pills. That seemed like her only path of escape, but that didn't strike any chords with Jim. When he found her unconscious, he dragged her through the house and beat her with a belt for about 3 hours. Iris escaped the next day with the help of a friend and was finally able to return to her parents' home in Florida. Her parents contacted the police, and she then gave a statement against Nolan. But of all the crimes Jim committed, the one that would bring him the most notoriety and mark the beginning of his downfall was about to unfold. Nolan, in a public parking lot, fired 13 rounds from a 9mm handgun, killing a man. Despite his claims of self-defense, this act set off a chain of events that would lead to the longest trial in the history of the U.S. District Court for the Southern District of Florida. The New Man. On July 11, 1981, at the Bashful Bandit Biker Bar in Tucson, a heated argument erupted between Jim and a man known as McQuillan over a song being played repeatedly on the jukebox. The situation escalated quickly when McQuillan brandished a .38 caliber gun. In response, Nolan fired 13 rounds from a 9mm handgun, hitting McQuillan 8 times, ultimately killing him. A Tucson police officer, witnessing the incident from a distance, arrested Nolan at the scene. State authorities charged Nolan with murder. However, while out on bail, Nolan found himself in even deeper trouble.
Charged with murder and anything else that they could come up and throw on. And when they arrested, I got out on bond for first-degree murder and parole violation, and was out on bond for a few days, and then the feds came in and arrested me for, they came to the house with a warrant because of the gun that was used in the alleged murder.
The Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, Firearms, and Explosives, ATF, apprehended him for federal weapons possession charges. As a convicted felon, Nolan was not allowed to possess firearms, but during his arrest, ATF agents found 3 guns in his living room.
They found 3 other guns in the house, so they turned around and I got locked up on that. So
Nolan's federal firearms trial faced multiple delays before finally starting on March 2, 1982. Remember Iris? She was present and she testified against Jim.
An old lady of mine is testifying against me. She's up there testifying. Now, Alan Meeker was the...
In the end, Nolan was convicted on all federal firearms charges and sentenced to 10 years in federal prison. However, while awaiting trial for McQuillan's murder, Jim underwent a personal transformation.
Read the book of Paul. And you know, as I later found out, Paul don't have a book. So I read Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. I read all 4 of those up there. Now I'm rereading Luke. And all of a sudden something came on me. I don't know what it was, but it came on me, and I started sobbing and crying. I was really, I always said later, I was really glad that happened alone, and I didn't have a bunch of people around. It was kind of...
He became a born-again Christian and started involving himself in the work of God, which involved mostly writing religious songs.
So I went ahead and said the sinner's prayer in the back, and if you're real, God, if this is all real and all that other stuff, it was like taking a 15-pound Valium. I mean, I just went like this, and it was great. I felt relaxed. I had a hate book that I had everybody's name. It was in my mind, but it was about the size of a New York phone directory.
All right.
And that was one of the things that would bother me. I hated everybody, you know. And all of a sudden, I didn't. And
when his murder trial began in June 1982, Nolan was acquitted of all charges after the jury ruled that he acted in self-defense.
I was found not guilty of everything that we've heard mentioned, the murders and all this other stuff, except for possession of a gun during the time when a guy shot at me 3 times and I was totally unarmed. I took a gun away from somebody else and shot him. And the only thing I was convicted of was grabbing that gun. If I'd have grabbed a knife and stabbed him, I wouldn't have gotten in trouble. Well,
Felon in possession of a
I
firearm.
found not guilty of everything else.
Despite his acquittal for McQuillan's murder and his new identity, he still had quite a number of his crimes to answer for. On June 3rd, 1986, federal authorities indicted the majority of the Outlaws' South Florida chapter, including Jim Nolan and his vice president, Fred Yankee Hegney. Nolan, already serving time in prison, was at the center of a sweeping racketeering case that covered various criminal activities from 1970 to 1985. Nolan faced serious accusations, including extortion, assault, ordering multiple murders, and forcing women into prostitution by threatening their families. The trial would become the longest in the history of the U.S. District Court for the Southern District of Florida, lasting 14 months.
Type of record in
Yeah,
trial history.
we turned around and I think we broke all the records for this
Wow.
district. That was the.
On January 23rd, 1989, Nolan was found guilty of violating and conspiring to violate the Racketeer Influenced and Corrupt Organizations Act, RICO. Out of 38 predicate acts brought against him, the jury concluded that 34 had been proven. Nolan was sentenced to 2 consecutive 25-year terms in federal prison, with the judge recommending that he serve the full 50 years before being considered for parole.
For the stuff out in Arizona, and before that 9 years was up, it was due to they brought me down there and they gave me 50 more years
Okay.
down there. So basically, if you and made it run consecutive with the time I was
What
doing.
about possibility of parole and?
This harsh sentence included the maximum 20 years for each racketeering count, with an additional 10 years added after prosecutors labeled Nolan a special dangerous offender. Nolan's imprisonment significantly weakened the Outlaws South Florida chapter, which had once been a dominant force. By the time of his sentencing in 1989, the chapter's membership had dwindled to fewer than a dozen members. After serving 26 years in prison, Nolan was released on October 21st, 2016. However, many people wonder if these 26 years fully compensate for the crimes he committed. Some argue that his sentence was too lenient, considering the severity of his actions, while others believe that his time in prison has adequately punished him for his crimes. What do you think?